Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is in solitary confinement awaiting sentencing for the murder of George Floyd. 3 other former Minneapolis police officers involved in Floyd's fatal arrest are set to stand trial in August. Sources tell our Minneapolis station, WCCO, they could soon face federal criminal civil rights charges. Derek Chauvin's murder trial has magnified the debate over police reform. In a recent article published in The Atlantic titled, "There Will Be More Derek Chauvins," Adam Serwer writes, quote, "Police unions have successfully instituted rules that make it tremendously difficult for officers who abuse their powers to be fired. The challenge is even greater when it comes to prosecuting police officers in court." Adam Serwer joins me now. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. Hi, Adam. Great to see you. So you say there are these significant systemic barriers in place to holding police officers accountable for misconduct. But there are also some cultural ones. For people who don't know, can you explain qualified immunity and how it plays into the culture?
Well, I would describe qualified immunity as a structural barrier. I mean, it's a legal doctrine that says police can't be held civilly liable for conduct that they cannot have, been expected to know was unconstitutional. But in practice, the way that the courts have instituted it, it's basically meant that there has to be a previous example of an officer being held liable for almost the exact same conduct, which means that in practice, qualified immunity has protected officers who have shot children, who have stolen money, who have destroyed people's property, who have, beaten people, who have just, engaged in conduct that any reasonable person would consider abusive. They've been shielded from civil liability as a result of qualified immunity. So it's not something that's written into U.S. law or in the Constitution. It's just sort of a legal doctrine that the courts have invented. And as a result, it'll require basically an act of Congress to narrow it or get rid of it. But it reflects something that I think, it does reflect a cultural expectation in the United States, which has existed for a long time, which is basically that, I think a lot of Americans, and this is something that we can see across the historical record, across the decades, particularly in moments of high crime, they basically expect police officers to get, rough with suspects that they think are guilty. And that gives them a lot of leeway when it comes to something like a jury, when it comes to being held accountable for misconduct, because people sort of expect police officers to be a little rough with people, even when that's clearly violates the law or is an abuse of their authority as agents of the state.
And, as we mentioned in your article, there will be more Derek Chauvins. You touch on how hard real reform will be. But we do know that since Chauvin's guilty verdict, there was a lot of hope that reform was on the way. Of course, there have been at least 6 more deaths of Black and brown people at the hands of police since that, since that verdict. But so do you think that this hope is misguided that followed Derek Chauvin's trial, that a new precedent for prosecuting police officers might be set?
I think it's a mistake to look at it as a precedent, because precedent generally, I know that we sometimes use it in a colloquial way, but basically it is extremely hard to convict a police officer of murder for killing someone in the line of duty. It almost never happens. And so in this case, was extremely unique because there was video of the incident. There are people, there were bystanders in the video who can be heard, trying to, telling Chauvin to take his knee off of Floyd, telling him that Floyd's life was in danger. This became there was a national outcry over this video, a bipartisan outcry, at least at first. So this was a very sort of unique social circumstance in which there was a tremendous amount of public pressure to hold this officer accountable for what everyone saw him do on camera. But typically, it really doesn't work out like this, and I think it would be a mistake to assume that because Chauvin was convicted in this particular unique instance, that means that future juries are going to be more willing to convict police officers who kill people in the line of duty, even when they do so, and it's clearly unjustified.
You know, and Adam, as you know, comprehensive police reform is a polarizing topic. And you say that there are these powerful political actors, such as police unions, committed to ensuring the system stays the way it is. The system of American policing remains unchanged. Can you sort of clarify specifically how these organizations make it difficult for police reform to move forward?
Well, in some ways, police unions are like other unions. They negotiate for higher wages and benefits on behalf of their members. But in one way, they're completely different, which is that they negotiate for disciplinary rules that shield police officers who are accused of misconduct, which, it goes from low-level misconduct to actual acts of violence. And there's no other union that you can union other than law enforcement unions where you can say that the unions are negotiate rules that protect people who have the authority to kill other people granted to them by the state. And these unions are extremely powerful. They went all out for Donald Trump in 2016 and helped him win the election. They referred to Kamala Harris, a former prosecutor, and Joe Biden, the author of the 1994 crime bill, a man who is very pro-cop, as the most radical anti-police ticket who ever existed. These are institutions that locally have a tremendous amount of influence. They mobilize a lot of votes. They can spend a lot of money, and they intimidate, politicians on both sides of the aisle out of, passing any kind of laws that would make it easier to fire or otherwise hold police officers accountable who abuse their authority. So there's that, but also, that also translates into a kind of political power where, if you are a local official like a mayor or a city manager, you really don't want to go up against the police union. That's a huge fight unless you know that you have the public on your side in a big way. And that's often not the case.
So in all of this legislation that lawmakers are now considering to establish some sort of new police reform precedent, is the role of police unions being taken into account? Is somebody challenging that power?
I mean, I think that obviously there are criminal justice advocacy groups who advocate on the other side of the issue from police unions. But the fact is that, politicians are really apprehensive about going against organizations that represent law enforcement because until recently, those organizations were really seen by a large segment of the public as trustworthy. If people want to believe that police officers are trustworthy, that they're there to protect them, and with law enforcement unions, that's actually not always the case. They're there to protect their members, not to protect you. And so, it's going to require a certain amount of civic bravery on behalf of elected officials to defy these organizations who are going to say, if you do anything to hold police officers accountable, you're responsible if a police officer is shot, you're responsible if crime goes up. And the only thing you can do is make sure that, we never get in trouble for anything, no matter how egregious, because otherwise, you're going to be living in an unsafe country. And that's the kind of argument that politicians are generally really apprehensive about hearing about themselves. They don't want to, commercials calling them soft on crime. And until recently, up until now, there haven't been a ton of politicians who are willing to stand up to these groups. In certain cases, you've seen the district attorneys elected, for example, who are willing to do so. But we have yet to see, I think, a big sweeping effort on the federal level to reform policing in a way to make officers who abuse their authority more accountable, to hold them accountable, because they are in fact very powerful. They have a tremendous amount of cultural and political power, and politicians are nervous about challenging it.
All right. Well, Adam Serwer of The Atlantic, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your perspective.
Thanks for having me.